The wind was a blade, sharp and merciless, slicing through the thin fabric of her dress. It howled not with the voice of nature, but with the shriek of a predator that had cornered its prey. Alara lay against the icy cradle of a fallen pine, the world a dizzying swirl of white. The snow was no longer a blanket, it was a shroud, stealing the warmth from her limbs, promising a final, silent peace. Below the frantic thunder of her own heart, she could hear two other, more fragile rhythms. The weak, mewling cries of the new lives she had brought into this frozen hell only hours before. Her twins, a boy and a girl, swaddled in the torn remnants of her petticoat, their tiny faces blue with cold. The blood on the snow around her was a stark, cruel painting of her failure. He had left them. Bartholomew, her husband, had looked upon the fruits of their union, the complication of their journey, and had cast them aside like unwanted baggage. He had struck her, a final act of contempt, and her fall against the rocks had left a ragged wound on her leg, a burning fire in the midst of the encroaching ice. Her life, once a structured poem of books and civility in Boston, had become a single, guttural scream against the vast, uncaring wilderness. She drew her children closer, a futile gesture against the infinite cold. Her prayer was no longer for salvation, but for a quick end, a mercy the plains seemed unwilling to grant. This was the story of her end. Or so she thought. A single tear froze on her cheek, a diamond of despair. But the heart of the frontier is a place of brutal endings and even more brutal beginnings, a place where the deepest wounds can sometimes be the very ground where the strongest love takes root. Have you ever felt so utterly abandoned that even the sky seemed to mock your existence? Have you ever stared into an abyss of hopelessness, believing that your story was over? This is the story of Alara, a woman left for dead, a mother with nothing but the fading warmth of her own body to offer her newborn children. But it is also the story of Coda, a man who had made a vow to silence his own heart, to live within a fortress of grief. It is a story that asks a simple question. Can two broken souls, lost in the unforgiving wilderness of the American West, piece each other back together to form a family? This is the tale of a love that was never supposed to happen, a love forged in the heart of a blizzard and sheltered by the honor of a man the world had deemed a savage. He was hunting not for sport, but for survival, his movements as silent as the falling snow. Coda, a man of the Comanche people, a warrior who had long ago traded the warmth of the tribe for the cold comfort of solitude, moved through the pines like a ghost. His past was a landscape of ash and sorrow, a wife and child taken by the white man's sickness, a grief so profound it had carved canyons into his soul. He lived now by the old ways, his only companions the wind and the memories that haunted his nights. He saw the tracks first, faint depressions in the snow, disturbed and desperate. It was not the trail of a deer or an elk. It was human, and it was wounded. He followed, his hand resting on the knife at his hip, his senses alert. He expected to find a trapper caught in his own snare, or a foolhardy prospector who had challenged the mountains and lost. He did not expect to find her. The splash of crimson on the white canvas of the snow stopped him. He approached with the caution of a wolf, his eyes taking in the scene. A woman, pale as the death that was courting her, her fine dress in tatters. And then he heard it. A sound so small, so fragile, it was nearly consumed by the wind. A baby's cry. He saw the two tiny bundles clutched to her chest. His heart, a thing he had believed to be a stone in his chest, clenched with a pain that was not his own. He saw not just a stranger, but the echo of his own lost world, the ghost of his own wife, the phantom cry of his own son. To leave them was to let the wilderness claim them. It was the logical choice. It was the choice his grief demanded. But the honor of his ancestors, the deep, unshakable core of the man he was, screamed a different command. He could not. The journey back to his cabin was a battle fought on three fronts. Against the relentless storm, against the dead weight of the unconscious woman in his arms, and against the torrent of ghosts that the wailing infants had unleashed in his mind. Coda moved with a grim determination that was etched into the lines of his face. He had first secured the babies, wrapping them in the thickest part of his own buffalo hide cloak, their tiny bodies a fragile warmth against his chest. Their cries were a constant, piercing reminder of the responsibility he had just shouldered, a weight far heavier than the woman he carried. He had lifted Alara with a gentleness that belied his formidable strength, her head lolling against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and ragged. The storm fought him for every step, its winds pushing and pulling, its snow blinding him, trying to swallow them all and erase their existence from the landscape. He navigated by instinct, by a knowledge of the land that was as much a part of him as his own blood. Each ridge, each tree, each stone was a landmark in the map of his memory. He pushed onward, his muscles screaming in protest, his resolve a burning coal in the center of the blizzard's fury. For Alara, the journey was a fevered dream, a terrifying kaleidoscope of fractured moments. She would drift into a hazy consciousness, aware only of the jarring motion, the biting cold, and the powerful, unyielding presence of the man who carried her. She saw a face of carved stone, framed by long, black hair, eyes as dark and deep as a forest at midnight. He was a savage, a nightmare figure from the lurid tales told back east. Fear, cold and sharp, would lance through her, and she would try to struggle, a weak, pathetic twitch of her limbs, before the darkness reclaimed her. She was his captive. He had saved her only to inflict some worse fate. The thought was a poison, and she prayed for the end, for the strength to just let go. Yet, through the fog of her terror, a small, persistent part of her registered something else. The steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her ear. The secure, almost protective way he held her. The way he would periodically adjust the hide around her, shielding her face from the worst of the wind. These were not the actions of a monster. They were the actions of a protector. The conflict tore at her weakened mind, leaving her suspended between terror and a sliver of bewildering hope as the dark shape of a cabin finally emerged from the swirling white. The cabin was a single room, built of sturdy pine and chinked with mud, a bastion of warmth against the raging storm. The air inside smelled of wood smoke, pine, and tanned leather. A fire already blazed in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Coda laid Alara gently on a cot piled high with furs, her body sinking into the softness. Then he turned his attention to the infants, unwrapping them with a surprising deftness and placing them in a makeshift cradle he had fashioned long ago from a hollowed log, a relic of a life he tried to forget. Their cries softened to whimpers in the sudden warmth. Alara watched him through slitted, heavy eyelids, her mind a swamp of fear and confusion. He moved with an economy of motion, his presence filling the small space. He was all hard angles and quiet intensity, a creature of the wilderness brought indoors. He stoked the fire, his back to her, and the muscles shifted under his deerskin shirt. Every instinct she possessed screamed that she was in mortal danger. This was a savage, an unknown, a man who lived by rules she could not comprehend. When he turned back to her, holding a steaming bowl, she flinched, pulling the furs tighter around her. He stopped, his dark eyes unreadable. He placed the bowl on a small stool beside the cot, and then looked at her leg, where the dark stain of blood had soaked through her dress. He gestured to it, a silent question. She shook her head, a pathetic, fearful motion. But he was not asking for permission. He took the knife from his belt, the same knife that had filled her with terror, and with a swift, clean motion, he slit the fabric of her skirt, exposing the ugly, swollen gash on her shin. She gasped, expecting a brutal touch, but his hands were unexpectedly careful as he cleaned the wound with warm water and a strange-smelling herbal poultice. His touch was impersonal, methodical, the touch of a man tending to a damaged tool, not a woman. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. When he was finished, he bound the wound with clean strips of linen he took from a wooden chest. The throbbing in her leg began to subside, replaced by a strange, tingling warmth from the herbs. He pushed the bowl of broth toward her again. "Eat," he said. The single word was not a request. It was a command, low and gravelly, the first he had spoken to her. She stared at him, her blue eyes wide with terror, and then at the steaming bowl. Survival warred with fear. Finally, prodded by a hunger that was sharper than her fear, she reached for it with a trembling hand, her gaze never leaving his face, convinced that any moment, the mask of civility would drop and the monster would be revealed. A week bled into the next, each day a mirror of the one before, measured not by a clock, but by the rising and setting of the sun behind the snow-laden pines. The blizzard had broken, leaving the world pristine and silent, draped in a blanket of blinding white. Inside the cabin, a different kind of silence reigned, thick with suspicion and unspoken questions. Alara's body healed, the fire in her leg banking to a dull ache, but her fear remained a stubborn, cold knot in her stomach. She watched Coda constantly, her mind a frantic ledger of his actions, searching for any sign of the brutality she expected. But it never came. He was a creature of routine and quiet competence. He rose before the sun, his movements fluid and silent as he rekindled the fire. He would leave for hours, returning with fresh game, a rabbit or a brace of grouse, which he would skin and prepare with an almost reverent efficiency. He chopped wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat in the frozen landscape. He mended his snowshoes with nimble fingers, stitched a tear in his moccasins, and sharpened his knife on a whetstone until it gleamed. He did all this with a profound lack of ceremony, as if these tasks were the only language he knew. He rarely spoke to her, and when he did, it was in short, practical statements. There is more wood. The water bucket is full. He treated her as he treated the fire or the cabin itself, as a part of the environment that required tending. Yet, he was not unkind. He ensured she always had broth or roasted meat, that the fire never died down, that the furs on her cot were kept dry. He cared for her and the children with a detached sense of duty that was both a comfort and a source of deep unease. The turning point came on a day when the sun was a weak, watery presence in the sky. Her son, whom she had silently named Micah, would not be soothed. He cried with a persistent, heartbreaking wail that grated on the silence of the cabin. Alara rocked him, sang to him, offered him what little comfort she could, but his distress only mounted. She felt a familiar despair creep in, the helplessness of a mother unable to soothe her own child. Coda, who had been oiling a rifle by the fire, stopped his work. He watched them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Alara tensed, expecting a sign of annoyance, an angry word. Instead, he rose, walked to the corner where he kept his carving tools, and picked up a small block of aspen wood. He sat back down, and with his knife, he began to carve. Alara watched, mesmerized, as his powerful hands worked with incredible delicacy. Shavings of pale wood fell to the floor like snowflakes. In a matter of minutes, a shape emerged from the block, a small, smooth, perfectly formed bird, its wings slightly raised as if in mid-flight. He sanded it with a piece of leather until it was as smooth as a river stone, then tied a sinew cord around it. He walked over to the cradle, his large frame casting a shadow over them, and dangled the wooden bird above Micah's face. The baby's cries faltered. His tear-filled eyes focused on the dancing shape. A tiny hand reached up, batting at the bird. A gurgle replaced the wail. The crying stopped. Coda looked from the quiet baby to Alara, his dark eyes holding hers for a single, charged second, and in that moment, the wall of her fear developed its first, undeniable crack. As Alara's physical strength returned, so too did a piece of the woman she had been before Bartholomew, before the journey west had stripped her of everything. She could no longer lie in the cot, a passive observer in her own survival. The first day she stood, her legs shaky but determined, the cabin seemed both smaller and more intimate. She saw not just a rustic shelter, but the detailed tapestry of a life lived in solitude. She saw the neat stack of furs, the row of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the carefully maintained tools. This was not a hovel, it was a home, albeit a lonely one. Her first act was to take Coda's torn shirt, the one he had discarded after a hunt, and mend it. Her fingers, still clumsy from disuse, fumbled with the needle and sinew he provided, but the simple, domestic act felt like a reclamation of her own identity. When he returned and saw the shirt, neatly folded on his cot with the tear invisibly stitched, he said nothing. He simply picked it up, examined the fine stitches, and gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was more eloquent than a paragraph of praise. A silent, unspoken rhythm began to develop between them. While he was out, she took over the care of the hearth, learning the temperament of the fire. She found his store of dried beans and ground corn, and began preparing simple meals, stews that filled the cabin with a savory aroma that was different from the simple smell of roasted meat. The cabin, once scented only by a solitary man, now carried the fragrance of a simmering pot, of clean linen of life. She would sit by the fire in the evenings, nursing one child while the other slept in the cradle he had made, and he would sit on his stool, carving or cleaning his rifle. The silence between them was no longer a chasm of fear, but a comfortable, shared space. It was in one of these quiet moments that she dared to break it with more than a practical question. "What should I call you?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked up from his work, his hands stilling. "My name is Coda." He said it simply, as a statement of fact. The name felt solid, like the mountains outside. "I am Alara," she offered in return. "And these are Hope and Micah." She had finally given them their names aloud, christening them in this strange, safe place. He nodded, his eyes lingering on the babies. "Hope," he repeated, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. "And Micah." He looked at her then, a real look, one that went past the surface of her existence. "They are strong," he said. It was a compliment of the highest order in his world, a recognition of the life force that had endured the storm. And in that moment, the small, smoky cabin, which had been a prison of fear, then a shelter from the storm, finally began to feel like a sanctuary, a place where a family, however unconventional, was beginning to be forged in the quiet spaces between two lonely hearts. The turning point, the moment the final wall of ice between them shattered, came on a night when the moon was a silver coin in a sky of black velvet. The children were sleeping soundly, their tiny breaths a soft rhythm in the quiet cabin. The fire crackled, casting a warm, golden glow that made the small space feel like the only bastion of light and warmth in the entire world. Elara was mending a tear in one of Hope's swaddling cloths when Coda spoke, his voice low, breaking the comfortable silence. "Why were you in the storm?" It was the first question he had asked about her past, the first sign of curiosity beyond her immediate survival. The question hung in the air, heavy and significant. Elara stopped her sewing, her hands trembling slightly. She looked into the flames, and the story she had held locked inside her, a story of shame and betrayal, began to pour out. She spoke of her life in Philadelphia, of her father the preacher, of a world of books, church socials, and structured certainties. She spoke of meeting Bartholomew, a man of wealth and charm who had promised her a grand new life in the untamed West. She spoke of the journey, of how his charm had curdled into a cruel possessiveness, his words becoming barbs and his hands heavy. She told him of the final, terrible day, of the early labor, of his disgust and fury at the inconvenience of it all. Her voice broke as she recounted his final words, the cold contempt in his eyes as he pushed her away and rode off, leaving her and their newborn children to be erased by the snow. When she finished, tears were tracing silent paths down her cheeks, not tears of self-pity, but of a grief finally given voice. Coda listened without interruption, his face a stoic mask, but his eyes, fixed on hers, were filled with a deep, consuming attention. When she fell silent, he did not offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. Instead, he offered her a piece of his own brokenness. "I had a family," he began, his voice rough with disuse and memory. "A wife, Mourning Dove, and a son, Little Hawk." He spoke of their life in the village, of the laughter of his son, of the strength and wisdom of his wife. Then his voice hardened, turning to stone. He spoke of the coughing sickness, the white man's disease that had swept through their camp like a prairie fire. He spoke of the agent at the nearby fort who had promised medicine and then withheld it, hoarding it for the settlers, deeming the lives of his people worthless. He described in spare, brutal detail, holding his son's hand as the fever stole his last breath, and watching his wife follow him to the spirit world a week later. The world had become silent after that. He had left his people, unable to bear the ghosts in their eyes, and had sought a silence to match the one in his own soul. He had come to these mountains to be forgotten. In the quiet that followed his story, a profound understanding passed between them. They were two survivors of different, yet similar, tragedies. Both had lost everything. Both had been betrayed by a world that did not value them. They were not a white woman and a Comanche warrior. They were simply Elara and Coda, two souls who recognized the landscape of grief in each other's eyes. In that shared vulnerability, a new emotion began to tentatively bloom, more precious than passion, more resilient than romance. It was the feeling of being truly seen. Miles away, in the muddy, rutted streets of the frontier town of Redemption, a place that rarely lived up to its name, Bartholomew cursed his luck. He had survived the blizzard, his superior horse carrying him to safety while he imagined Elara and the brats freezing solid, a fitting end for their inconvenience. He had spent the intervening weeks drinking and gambling, nursing his bruised ego and imagining the inheritance he would claim from Elara's wealthy father, spinning a tragic tale of a fatal blizzard and a brave, grieving husband. But the frontier had a long memory and a gossip's tongue. One evening, a grizzled trapper, his face a roadmap of hard winters, was telling a story at the saloon bar. He spoke of strange smoke rising from the forbidden slopes of the Grayback Mountains, the domain of a reclusive, ghost-like Comanche who was best left alone. And then he mentioned something else, a detail that made the whiskey glass in Bartholomew's hand stop halfway to his lips. The trapper swore he'd seen, through his spyglass, a flash of a woman's calico dress near the cabin, and heard what sounded like the cry of an infant on the wind. The description was vague, the story dismissed by most as drunken fantasy. But for Bartholomew, it was a lightning strike. Elara. It couldn't be. But what if it was? The thought that she had survived, that she was alive and with another man, a savage no less, ignited a firestorm of pure, possessive rage in his gut. She was his. Her life, her body, the very air she breathed belonged to him. The children, his issue, were his property. The idea that a redskin had dared to touch what was his was an unforgivable stain upon his honor. His greed warred with his fury. If she was alive, the story of her tragic death was useless. But reclaiming her, bringing her back to heel, would be a different kind of victory. He would punish her for her defiance. He would destroy the man who had sheltered her. He began to make inquiries, his money loosening the tongues of the desperate and the disreputable. He found 3 men, hard cases with vacant eyes and a thirst for gold, who were willing to ride into the mountains for a share of a promised reward. He didn't tell them the whole truth, only that a savage had stolen his wife, and he was going to get her back. As they rode out of redemption, a cold, cruel smile twisted Bartholomew's lips. He was not just going to reclaim his property. He was going to dispense his own brand of justice and erase this embarrassing chapter from his life, starting with the Indian and ending with the woman who had dared to survive him. The first sign of their approach was a disturbance in the woods, a single jay that cried out in alarm where there should have been silence. Coda, who was splitting logs near the cabin, froze, his head lifting, his senses instantly on high alert. He had felt a disquiet on the wind all morning, a subtle wrongness in the fabric of the day. He glanced toward the cabin, where Alara was inside with the children. A fierce, protective instinct, an emotion he thought had died with his son, surged through him. He set the axe down and moved silently to the side of the cabin, retrieving the rifle that was always kept leaning there. Inside, Alara heard the birds cry and saw the sudden tension in Coda's posture through the open doorway. Fear, a cold, familiar ghost, coiled in her stomach. But this time it was different. It was not the paralyzing terror of a victim, but the sharp, focused fear of a mother protecting her young. She quickly and quietly laid the sleeping twins in their cradle, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Coda met her eyes from the doorway. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Bar the door." She nodded, her hands already moving to slide the heavy wooden bar into place. Then, she did something the Alara of a few months ago would never have conceived of. She went to the corner where Coda kept a second, older rifle, one he had been teaching her to load and fire. Her hands were steady as she checked the load, the movements he had drilled into her coming back with a desperate clarity. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a defender. Outside, Bartholomew and his men rode into the clearing, their horses trampling the new spring growth. Bartholomew reined in his horse, a sneer of triumph on his face as he saw the cabin. "Alara," he bellowed, his voice a vile intrusion in the peaceful clearing. "Your husband has come for you. Come out of that filthy hovel at once." Coda stepped out from the side of the cabin, his rifle held loosely at his side. He was a figure of silent, immovable power, a part of the mountain itself. Bartholomew's sneer faltered slightly at the sight of the man. "You," he spat. "Savage. You will give me my wife and my children, and I might let you live." Coda did not answer. He simply stood, a guardian before the gate. Enraged by the silence, Bartholomew dismounted. "I am talking to you. She is my property." Just then, the cabin door unbarred, and Alara stepped out. She did not cower. She did not look afraid. She stood beside Coda, the second rifle held firmly in her hands, her eyes burning with a cold fire Bartholomew had never seen before. "I am not your property, Bartholomew," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the clearing. "You have no right to me or to my children. You left us to die. Leave this place now." Bartholomew stared, momentarily stunned by this transformation. The meek, compliant woman he had married was gone, replaced by this fierce, defiant stranger. His shock quickly turned to white-hot fury. "You dare!" he shrieked, raising his pistol. "You will learn your place." The clearing exploded into chaos. One of the hired men charged, and Coda met him with a blur of motion, his rifle used as a club, disabling the man with brutal efficiency. Gunshots rang out, but it was Alara who fired the decisive shot. As Bartholomew leveled his pistol at Coda's back, she raised her rifle, aimed, and fired. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Bartholomew's arm, sending his pistol flying into the dirt. He screamed a high, pathetic sound, clutching his bleeding arm. The other 2 hired guns, seeing their employer disabled and facing 2 determined defenders, lost their nerve. They turned their horses and fled back into the woods. The confrontation was over. Bartholomew knelt in the dirt, whimpering, defeated not just by a warrior's strength, but by the courage of the woman he had so grievously underestimated. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a profound quiet descended upon the clearing, broken only by Bartholomew's pathetic moans. The threat had been vanquished, not just by Coda's formidable skill, but by their united stand. They had fought as one, a silent pact of protection made real. Coda retrieved Bartholomew's pistol, his face grim. He looked at the defeated man, a creature of greed and cruelty now reduced to a bleeding, whimpering child, and felt not triumph, but a weary kind of disgust. He bound Bartholomew's hands and tended to his wound with a detached, clinical efficiency, offering the same basic care he would to any wounded animal. There was no vengeance in his actions, only a final, necessary task. He would not kill him. To do so would be to stoop to Bartholomew's level, to let the man's poison taint the sanctuary they had built. Instead, he would deliver him to the justice of his own people. He slung Bartholomew over one of the abandoned horses and, with a final, long look at Alara, a look that conveyed everything that did not need to be said, he led him away, a specter of the past being led out of their future. 2 years later, the cabin was no longer just a cabin. It was a home. A new room had been added, with a window that let in the bright morning light. A small garden grew nearby, fenced to keep out the deer, its neat rows of vegetables a testament to Alara's care. The clearing was filled with the sound of children's laughter. Hope and Micah, now sturdy toddlers with their mother's blue eyes and Coda's dark hair, chased butterflies in a meadow vibrant with wildflowers. Alara stood on the porch, her face serene, watching them. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding peace. She was no longer a resilient survivor. She was a woman who had truly found her home. Coda came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together in a gesture that was both familiar and sacred. He had returned from delivering Bartholomew to the authorities, and had never left again. The silence he had once sought had been filled with a life he never dared to dream of. His grief for his first family had not vanished, but it had softened, making room in his heart for this new one, forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. They were a strange and beautiful tapestry, woven from different worlds, bound together by honor, courage, and a love that was as quiet and as powerful as the mountains that sheltered them. And so we come to the end of our story. But is it really an end? Or is it a beginning? The story of Alara and Coda is a testament to the enduring power of the human heart to heal, to find hope in the deepest despair, and to build a family not from blood, but from love. It reminds us that sometimes our greatest trials are the very paths that lead us to our truest selves and our most profound joys. What do you think? Can love truly conquer all wounds? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story of hope and redemption touched your heart, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you never miss a story of the inspirational frontier. Thank you for joining us.